Hello again, everyone. So, in the last episode, what we did was we went ahead and touched on the question of whether or not universal common descent is falsifiable. And just as a recap, what we talked about was that universal common descent is often coupled with auxiliary hypotheses. And often, when a prediction ends up not coming to pass for universal common descent, what ends up taking the bullet isn't the theory itself, but it's these auxiliary hypotheses that have been coupled with universal common descent. Going along that theme, we're going to look deeper into this problem. This presentation is about how do we infer that two things are homologous, right? So essentially, evolutionary biologists they try to group species based off of similarity into these trees called phylogenetic trees or phylogenies, and they use that using probability, right? So on a probabilistic evidentialist perspective, they are coupling groups of species of different diversities, and they are attempting to sort of map them into one coherent diagram. Now, one of the major points that I'm going to touch on in this lecture is that evolutionary biologists often separate two major questions. The first of which is how life began, and the second is how life evolved. And what we will be doing in this lecture is I'm going to explain this dichotomy and why it's wrong to assume, or why it's wrong to keep these two questions separate. We'll show that assumptions about life's origins have a huge influence on how we interpret similarities among organisms to begin with, right? The whole tree of life model assumes a particular view on life's origin. And unless we're actually addressing abiogenesis, we're not actually going to be able to find a solid solution for the question of how do we actually infer homology. So now it's been known for decades that the origin of life and also subsequent evolution are two fundamentally different scientific questions. So abiogenesis is essentially a completely separate topic and a field of science, as well as even a research topic, as is evolution or diversification. And this is actually seen very early on, even by Darwin himself. He says it is no valid objection that science as yet throws no light on the far higher problem of the origin of life. Who can explain what is the essence of the attraction of gravity? So quotes like these and mindsets like this give off the implication that many researchers don't mind hand waving this whole issue of life's origin when it comes to the evolution debate. But again, as I'll show in this presentation, how you understand the origin of life, abiogenesis, has a major impact in how you argue for or against evolution. So just to make this clear, ideas about abiogenesis and life's origins are extremely connected to the relationship that organisms have to one another. So, if the way life arose can affect what patterns we expect in biodiversity, then assumptions about life's origins might influence phylogenetic inferences, right? What I mean by that is that, again, when we're trying to map out biodiversity through these phylogenetic trees, given certain similarities that we find amongst them, we can only be certain of a parsimonious diagram if we're assuming a particular paradigm about abiogenesis. And I'll go ahead and flush that out in a couple of slides here. So, one of the major questions that this presentation is trying to address, as well as far greater questions for those trying to understand evolution, is when it comes to probabilistic structures of phylogenetic trees, is there some kind of overlooked problem in how we're inferring these phylogenies? This is essentially the central question I want to address in this presentation. Just to be clear and just to flesh that out more, what I'm asking is we have maps and diagrams of these phylogenetic trees of species, and they've been arranged in a particular way. Is there an issue in the way we are inferring these similarities based off of homology? So essentially, like when scientists conclude that certain species have a common ancestor, are they making an assumption about probability that we haven't really understood or examined? That's like the major point in this discussion, right? We will show that multiple evolutionists, when they make these assumptions, bold claims that two organisms share a common ancestor, they are operating under a paradoxical hidden assumption about a particular view of probability. And once those notions are dispelled, you'll see why this whole inference of homology falls right off the ground. So We'll go ahead and show that. But before I do any of that stuff, one of the major points I want to do just to orient ourselves with regards to the presentation is that you should have an idea of what are the different positions of evolution in the literature. And the next slide will show a full diagram of this. But essentially, you can imagine an x-axis and a y-axis. And one of the axes are essentially talking about the metaphysics of explanation, right? So we're basically looking at the reasons why anything exists to begin with. So whether things exist under a naturalistic, unguided process, or if it's due to intelligent design of some kind. You can imagine one of those as just questioning about the metaphysics of our explanation. And the other axis, you can understand it as the historical pattern, right? So did all organisms descend from a single tree of life, or was it like a forest of life, right? One with multiple origination events. You can look at these four plausible scenarios to orient yourself with regards to the positions that are available. You can have a scenario where you have a last universal common ancestor, or Luca for short, and at the same time, there is no design, right? So essentially, what this is saying is that all life shares one ancestor through purely natural evolution, which is often classic Darwinian view. And so you have a number of, I would say, majority of scientists are probably in this camp, right? Or at least majority of evolutionists are probably in that camp. They believe that there's no design amongst species, as well as that there is only one particular universal common ancestor that forms this tree of life that connects all other species. Now, alternatively, you can have design with multiple origins, right? Luca does not exist in this case. There's no design. All this is saying is that life began several times independently through natural processes, and these trees form a forest as opposed to a single tree of life. You can also have a scenario where you allow for design and still admit there's only one tree of life, right? What this view is saying is that there's a single common descent for all kinds of life forms orchestrated by an intelligent cause. The nature of this cause is not necessarily stipulated upon, but the idea is that things are designed in a particular manner. Now, the last approach or the last model is one in which you have intelligent design as well as multiple origins, right? So this is basically the view that multiple separate created lineages gave rise or arose from an overall orchestrated framework where things are done for a particular reason or there's motivation for a particular species to exist. And so again, this is one that bridges design with a kind of force of life approach. Now, despite these differing worldviews, historically, many scientists converged on the idea of a single common ancestor. The question is, why is that the case? They assumed that independent origins of similar lives are extremely unlikely. And so that's the main point here. So multiple scientists have agreed that if life arose at all, it arose only once, right? And that's seen as like a unwritten assumption. It's always there. That assumption's always, that's one of the auxiliary hypotheses that we talked about in the last episode. But what this means is that for multiple origins to have occurred, right, where Luca does not exist, and you have multiple independent origins, that is seen as extremely unlikely just given probability. So, for instance, Asa Gray, who was one of the contemporaries of Darwin, as well as Richard Dawkins himself, agree on there being a tree of life, but they agree on it for completely different reasons, right? One obviously believes in design, the other does not believe in design at all. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is that it's not a dichotomy. It's not necessarily a one or the other. You can have a bridge of both. You can have a scenario where you adopt design and you also adopt Luca, or you can also adopt naturalistic causes while also adopting Luca. The point is that whatever your metaphysic turns out to be, it's going to vary drastically on how you interpret the data for universal common descent. So what this is saying is that often biologists, when they encounter these striking similarities between organisms, where do they go from there? For example, suppose that two species have genes that are 95% identical in DNA sequences. Such a close match obviously screams for an explanation, right? If you have two organisms and they have 95% identical DNA, the obvious question is why are they sharing so much DNA? How do we explain this kind of similarity? Did those two organisms inherit the gene from a common ancestor? or did they arrive at the same genetic sequence independently? Those are your only two options, right? It's either shared ancestry or independent origin. This is a classical inferential problem. When we see a complex match, do we infer a common cause or do we attribute it to coincidence? So again, there's only two options. Either the similarity in genetic code is due to a common cause, right, a common ancestor, or it's just coincidental that they both independently have that particular genome sequence. Now, the reason why this is a problem is because suppose you had two scenarios. Let's say you have two organisms, and the first organism, let's just say that is organism A, right? And organism A has a particular genome sequence. Now, organism B also ends up having the same exact genome sequence. So you have two scenarios, right? The first scenario is common ancestry, where organism A and organism B both got the gene from the last common ancestor. And the gene was present once at birth and then underwent changes or mutations along each lineage. The second scenario is that organism A and B each originated that gene from scratch coincidentally, completely separately. Now, each would require its own origin of life or origin of trait event producing that similar gene, followed by any later changes, right? Just to explain this better, let's say that you had scenario one where you have A and B. Now, A and B are both 95% identical in terms of their DNA sequence, right? And with regards to common ancestry as being the first sequence, again, the question is what explains the 95%? The first scenario is saying that there is some common denominator between A and B. Let's call it C. C had this genome sequence. Let's assume hypothetically the genome sequence is something like A, C, C, ACCG, right? Actually, let's say if I can, no, it's not. Okay. Let's say this has an A in the beginning, right? So these are almost identical sequences. This is ACCG as its base pairs, and this has AACG, right? So they're like very close, almost identical, 95% identical. The question is, what explains this identicality in their genome sequence? And the answer to that question, according to scenario one, right, common ancestry, is that they both share a common ancestor, C, and C has a preserved genome sequence of ACG. Now, because C has ACCG in its genome, it will give rise to both A and B, at least in terms of this ACCG segment. And that's why they are both 95% identical, right? That explains their similarity, right? This is scenario one, where they both are arriving at the similarity because of a common ancestor. Now, let's look at scenario B. In the second scenario, this is going to be separate origins, right? So species A and species B. And let's say again, species B has the genome sequence A, C, G, and A, G, and then let's give this a C after. Let's give this an A. All right. So once again, we have organism A and organism B. And both A and B have a 95% identical similarity in their genome, right? Now, again, the question is, this similarity cries out for an explanation. So what is an explanation for this similarity? And according to scenario two, the explanation is not a universal common ancestor, but rather a unique conserved ancestor. So let's say this is, let's make it little a. I can make that better. So we're looking at little a. So what this is saying is that what gave rise for the capital A organism and what gave rise to its genome is this little a. Let's say it's A, C, C, oops, G, and then A again. Little a is an ancestor to big A, right? But little a has this conserved DNA sequence, and it's also found in this DNA sequence, right? And just from scratch, little a had this and it conserved it into our modern species or our modern organism A, right? With regards to B, it's the same thing. So it has the same genetic code, right? B gave rise to big B, and again, it had the same genetic code. So what's the explanation for why they share 95% similarity in their genome? Why does big A and big B share 95% similarity? It's because of chance, right? It's because the predecessors for A and the predecessor for B both had this particular genome sequence of CCGA, and due to that, they both share a very high degree of similarity in their DNA. But again, what's the explanation for that? It's purely chance, right? Now, one thing you have to understand here, and this is a really crucial point. So there's two questions, right? How hard is it for that gene to appear at all? And the second question is, how likely are small differences after it appears? Those are two questions that are really important when it comes to inferring homology. We can't infer homology without having an answer or at least understanding those two questions, right? So let's say we're talking about this gene ACGC. How hard is it for that gene to appear at all? Now, that's a tough question. What that's basically asking is, how likely is it for that gene to have occurred? How likely is it for that gene to have originated? In other words, how likely is it for that organism to have existed? That's essentially what it's saying. Now, because of the kind of question that this is, you can't really answer that without a dedicated worldview that tells you about the likelihood of your existence to begin with, right? So again, we're asking, how likely is it or how hard is it for a gene like this to exist in the first place? Under the assumption that life only began once, it's going to be unlikely that this gene exists, right? Forget about this gene. It's very unlikely that any of us exist. It just so happened by chance that the right conditions were met under this abiogenesis account that we exist in the first place, right? And so what I can call this is the origination probability. Origination probability is basically how likely is it that a gene or a organism or a human, it doesn't matter what it is, right? But how likely is it that a gene could appear at all, right? In other words, how likely is it for A to exist? And how likely is it for B to exist? And then the second probability is called transitional probability, right? As given the origin, how likely is it that subsequent changes are going to occur in future generations? So you have big A and big B, and we see that they have this change in one allele pair, right? In this case, it's C. But again, the point is that there are two major questions here, right? Are two major concepts. The first is the origination probability, and the second is the transition probability. We cannot understand or we cannot address the concept of homology without understanding origination probability, because everything that we infer based off of homology is working under the assumption that our origination probability is a particular way, right? So let me expand on that a bit. So now what do I mean by that? Let's see. Actually, we'll just leave this here. Okay, let me get rid of this. There you go. This also just goes over exactly what I just said, right? But the main idea here, and I'll repeat myself, the main idea here is that scientists usually they'll find scenario two, the one with independent origins, far more unlikely for when it comes to similarities and when it comes to the explanation for why 95% are identical. It's not just scientists, even us, like our own intuition says the same thing, right? Our own intuition says that it's so improbable that two organisms could independently arrive at the same intricate gene sequence by chance, right? Just as an analogy, anyone has his intuition, right? So let's say that you found two books and the books are 95% identical in terms of their content, right? Like word for word identical. Now, you only have two possibilities, right? you suspect that one copied from the other, right? Or both of those authors coincidentally wrote the exact same thing in the exact same way. You're not going to go with the latter view, right? You're not going to say that both authors coincidentally wrote the same thing. It's a lot more probable that both authors relied on a single source, right? Author one must have either relied on, assuming author one was before author two, that means author two either relied on author one, or assuming they came out with the same material at the same time, you can argue that both authors essentially copied from a common source, right? But that's how intuition works. That's how we catch plagiarizers. That's why plagiarism is such a huge crime, right? The way that we catch plagiarizers is we say, okay, there's this copied essay or paragraph, and it's identical with this other paragraph. So again, either someone copied it from the other, or they both copied it from a common source, right? But the whole point here is that in biology, the major prevailing thought has been that similarity beyond a trivial level almost always means homology. That's the major assumption when it comes to evolution. So the only alternative would be believing in kind of many recurrent independent origins of similar genes against all the odds. This is one of the implausible scenarios where natural selection happened to shape different genes into near identical forms, right? That just doesn't happen. That just seems way too coincidental. Now, essentially, the main principle here is that it's like causes, right? Which is high complexity plus a high similarity points to a single cause, right? Not multiple causes, right? As well as having high amounts of similarity, that just tells us intuitively that it's coming from a common source. It's not coming from independent origins, right? Again, that's how our intuitions work. But the question is this a valid approach? Is there any flaw in the way that we are assuming this, right? Is there any flaw in the way that we're inferring homology when it comes to similarities? But before I touch on that question, one of the paleontologists, Dr. Patterson, he says himself, he says, convergence between molecular sequences is too improbable to occur. If two structures are complex enough and similar enough in detail, probability dictates that they must be homologous rather convergent, right? So in other words, if we see that two complex biological features that match closely, the odds of this happening or the odds of this happening independently or through convergence, it's deemed so tiny that we conclude they must share a common origin of homology. And so the conclusion of this thought process is that we count on similarity not to mislead us. The underlying assumption is that when you have this level of complexity and it's still so similar, nature can't produce this much complexity coincidentally. It's not feasible on a probabilistic framework to assume that nature would just coincidentally produce so many of these similar species, similar gene sequences, etc., right? And so this reasoning underlies why the tree of life concept has been so widely accepted throughout the biological domain, right? So all life shares many complex similarities, whether that be DNA codes or cell structures. And again, that's taken as strong evidence that everything must come from one common ancestor. So I hope that makes it clear why common ancestry is often inferred from these types of things. It's highly dependent on this assumption that similarity is so improbable if it occurred coincidentally, right? But now the question is, what does it actually mean for something to occur coincidentally, right? Like it sounds compelling. The argument sounds quite intuitive, right? But the question is, what does it mean for something to be coincidental? Also, the whole concept of improbable. What does it actually mean for something to be improbable? So to address that, I have to first make the hidden assumption clear. The assumption, when we see two similar essays or two similar books, we infer that one must have plagiarized from the other, or they both must have plagiarized from a third source. That's just our intuition. That's how it works. But the question is why? Why do we assume that? And the hidden assumption is this thing called the probability of origin. And so I mentioned the origination probability. This is the exact same thing, right? So the logic is essentially that the origination probability of such complex features of life is extremely low, right? The fact that you and I exist, the fact that we have 5 fingers, the fact that we have eyes, according to naturalists, so improbable, it's extremely low. And that's why getting the same features twice, even more impossible, right? So just to that out, we're assuming that the probability that we exist in the first place is already so low. And because it's so low, the probability of life originating not just once, but twice, and potentially even 5, 6, 7 times, is even more improbable. That is essentially the hidden assumption. So, to flush that out a bit more, why is it assumed that life is so improbable, right? Why is it assumed that you and I existing is so improbable to begin with? The reason for that, and this goes into abiogenesis, is because whatever model you're invoking, let's say it's the RNA world hypothesis model, and I will have a completely separate presentation on abiogenesis and the different models available and what's being discussed in the literature currently. But the point is that you have to have the right amount of RNA molecules, right? You have to have the right of those molecules. You have to have perfect enantiomers, right? They have to be perfectly superimposed on one another. You also have to have perfect external conditions to exist, right? You have to have the cooling phase, and then you have to have an explosion phase, and there has to be a perfect amount of nitrogen, a perfect balance of carbon, and a bunch of these things, right? To have amino acids, right? And we're not even talking about life yet. We're just talking about the formation of amino acids from scratch. And already it's so improbable, right? Obviously, when it gets to life, it's going to be even more improbable. And now we're assuming not just one origination event, but multiple origination events. In other words, multiple non life to life events. That is going to be even more extraordinarily improbable, right? So the hidden assumption here is that the fact that me and you exist is already so low in terms of probability. And because of that, if me and you have a similar feature, what's more probable? The null hypothesis has to be that me and you come from a common source, a common origin, right? That's because we're under the assumption that the fact that we exist in the first place is already so improbable, right? Not just the matching of features that matter. It's also the belief that having those features in the first place are so rare, right? So the whole argument that similarity is due to only works if separate emergence is extremely improbable, right? Because similarity from common ancestry, if you rule out multiple origins, right? So just to be clear, if you rule out this picture, that is the only way, these two pictures, right? If you can rule out these two models of evolution, that is the only way you can keep these two models, right? And again, this has to be explicitly mentioned, and I hope I'm being clear here. But the point is that these origination events, all on the bottom of this diagram, these multiple origination events have to be practically zero in order for this concept to exist, right? In order for this concept to exist, these origination events must be practically zero, right? And if we say that these are zero, then the only alternative left is to say that there's one. It's already assumed that this one common origin existing is already so improbable. The fact that all of these existing is even more improbable. It's extraordinarily improbable, right? That's the logic here. What's another thing to consider here is the following, right? So let's say you had a string. Now on the string, you have a bead. You can move this bead either to your right or to your left, right? Now imagine that this string and this bead represent the origination probability, right? So this origination probability is represented by the string and bead. Now, again, probability is on this framework of 0 to 1. Let's assume this is 0 and this is 1. If you take your bead and slide it to the left, closer to 1, you're basically saying that this is low origination probability. This is such a low probability, it's practically impossible, right? It's practically non-existent. So the fact that me and you exist, it's assumed that this bead is like over here somewhere, right? It's assuming that the fact that me and you exist is so close to 0, it's practically impossible that we exist, right? Yet we do exist, right? So that's why it's very close to 0. Now, if this is the case with only one origination event, multiple origination events are going to be even more closer to 0, right? So this maybe would be 2 origination events, maybe 3 origination events, 4, all until you get to 0 0.0, sorry, 0.0, oh, all the way to 0.0009, right? assuming this is like 4 origination events, we're very close to 0. The more origination events that you postulate, the more you can add this number with another trailing 0. So you can just add 0.0009, 0.00009, etc., etc., etc. But the point here is that the more origination events you invoke, the closer to 0 you get. This is basically saying that the assumption is that scientists are assuming our existence is already close to 0. Now, let's imagine a second scenario, right? Let's imagine the same string, and on that string we have a bead. The assumption is that it's very probable that life exists. Let's assume that it's very probable that life could exist from non-life, right? Given the right conditions, it's going to be super conducive. Now, all of a sudden, the origination probability goes all the way close to 1, right? So we're talking about 0.999 going infinitely, right? But the point is that if we start with this assumption, then this completely changes everything. This changes how we infer homology. If we're saying that there's an environment that's so inducive for life, then we're saying that it's no longer improbable that life exists. Now we're saying that it's very highly probable, right? Almost completely guaranteed that life will exist, right? Because we're almost at 1. We're saying that life is so probable that it's almost a guarantee. So we move this bead as close as we could to 1, going this way. That again has major implications. Now, if we go back and we talk about organism A and B, like I did a couple of slides ago, right? So we have organism A and we have organism B. Remember, I said that there was 2 reasons. Let's say they have 95% identical DNA, right? So again, there was 2 reasons. One reason said that it's because they both share a common ancestor in C. That was scenario 1. The second scenario is you have A and you have B, and again, they're 95% identical, but what give rise to A and B are separate, unique, independent origins, independent ancestors. Now, it seemed very improbable for scenario 2 to exist, right? The fact that 2 organisms have 95% similarity and that you're going to say it's coincidental, right? A few minutes ago, we thought that was quite improbable, right? And we thought that it's more probable that A and B must have shared a common ancestor C. But I hope now that I've broken down this origination probability, you see the difference between scenario 1 and scenario 2. Scenario 1, we're assuming that the bead is much closer to 0, right? That's an arrow, by the way. So we're assuming that the bead is closer to 0. We're like over here somewhere, right? And this is going to be 1. So in terms of scenario 1, where you have common ancestor, so what explains 95% similarity? It's common ancestry. We're assuming that origination probability is as close as we could to 0, right? Like 0.0001 or something, right? That's what we're assuming, and that's what must be true for us to infer homology, right? For us to say that homology is the most parsimonious explanation, we have to assume that the bead is as close as we could to 0. In other words, we have to assume that it's highly improbable that A exists in the first place and that B exists in the first place. That is the only way we can infer homology as being the most parsimonious explanation. For scenario 2, it's the opposite, right? For scenario 2 to be true, we have to assume on this number line and on the string, we have the bead, we have to go this way, right? This would be 0, this would be 1. Now we're like here somewhere. What we're saying is that it is highly probable, extremely probable, that the 2 species will exist. In fact, it's almost a guarantee that they will exist and have 95% similarity in their DNA structure. Now, this case must be assumed in order to believe in scenario 2. But I hope you guys are understanding this quite clearly. What I'm trying to say here, and just to simplify everything, is that infer homology, in order to infer common descent based off of similarity, you have to assume that the origination probability is low. And likewise, in order to assume that there's independent causation or independent origination, you have to assume that the probability is high. And that's the whole issue here. The whole dilemma is that we can't assume homology is due to common descent unless we assume that origination probability is low. But inherently, there's no reason to assume origination probability is low to begin with. And that is the whole issue with using homology as your basis for evidence of common ancestry. And again, this is really important because practically every shred of evidence for a common descent and also the tree of life in Luca, every shred of evidence is dependent on homology, right? Whether that be anatomical evidence, the fossil record, whether that be genetic, molecular evidence, whatever evidence you're looking at, it's based off of the assumption of homology. Homology is the driving factor here. The evidence for evolution cannot be posited unless you concede to the hidden assumption of homology. So what I'll do now is I'll go through a thought experiment, a counterexample, just so that you guys can understand this point. What is a quartz? This is one of the examples that Professor Paul Nelson, he is a professor of philosophy of science. And so he has given, I thought was a good example. So I will mention it here. These quartz are like crystals. They look the same everywhere. But the thing is that each crystal, right, it's formed independently from one another, right? Now, no one thinks that all of these crystals trace back to one common ancestor, right? Now, why is that? Why is it that whenever you see this crystal, you can see the same exact crystal somewhere in Antarctica and here in Michigan, but you're not going to assume that the crystal in Antarctica and the crystal here in Michigan, somewhere along the line, somewhere in history, they must have shared a common ancestor. The reason why you don't think that they both have a common ancestor is because it's actually quite easy to make right? It's actually quite easy to make crystals. You can make it in your house, right? You can make it with a pressure cooker if you want to, right? And so because the origination probability of the crystal is actually so high, given the right environment, you can actually make it in your own house. Seeing two identical crystals doesn't imply that one came from the other, right? Because nature can just produce the same structure repeatedly. It's quite easy for nature to reproduce it, right? That's why, let's say you're in a cave somewhere in some part of the world and two different places, and you notice the same exact structure, it's made of the same exact thing, you're not going to infer common ancestry. You're not going to say there's a mini quartz somewhere that is a hybrid between the two. That's because you're assuming the origination probability for the is high, right? And that's a perfect example where you can have similarity, right? And that does not mean it's due to common descent. This is why probability matters. The probability of the origination, not just the matching features, is what guides our inference. Inference, based off of those phylogenetic trees that I was mentioning in the beginning of the first slide, those phylogenetic trees, we're inferring homology not because of similarity, but because of the origination probabilities. Subconsciously, we're assuming that it's so improbable for these species to have existed to begin with that they must be related in one way or another. They cannot be independent because that's already so improbable, right? Again, what's driving our intuition and what's driving our inference, it's not similarity, but rather it's the origination probability. So if something can arise easily and if it can arise often, then seeing it twice or three times or multiple times, whether that be a gene, whether that be property, whether that be hand, a limb, an appendage, whatever it may be, right? If it can arise easily and often, then seeing it twice or multiple times, it's not really surprising. If it's hard to arise even once, however, then seeing it twice is actually quite stunning. That's the whole point of this lecture. The quartz example is no different from a gene, right? So a complex gene sequence, it's thought to have an extremely low chance of popping up from scratch, essentially. So two organisms that share that same gene sequence, again, it's assumed that gene sequence can't just pop up by chance, right? But again, that's an assumption that based off of a low origination probability, right? The quartz example is kind of the same thing. Crystals have a high chance of forming whenever possible. So identical crystals don't necessitate a common ancestor. It doesn't imply a common ancestor. And so the general principle is that when you're confronted with similarity, you have to ask, how likely is it that each instance could appear independently? Now, a low probability of independent appearance makes common origin the better explanation. However, a high probability of independent appearance actually means multiple occurrences aren't actually that shocking and they don't require a single source, right? Origination probability kind of tilts the scale between coincidental convergence and common cause. And I think that really is the crux of this presentation. It has to be inferred. That's the general rule, right? Similarity plus low origination probability equals common cause, right? In order to have common cause, you must have similarity as well as a very low common probability. To say that the more parsimonious explanation is common ancestry, again, you have to have those two assumptions. Yeah, you have similarity and low origination probability, and therefore common cause is the most parsimonious explanation. That's what explains the inference to the best explanation is common cause, right? And here's some examples that you can look at. The Mona Lisa analogy, right? Mona Lisa is very complex. It's very hard to recreate. And because it's hard to recreate, that means that to create it to even begin with was already so improbable. Therefore, if there are multiple Mona Lisas, we assume they must have come from one another, or they must have relied on the original Mona Lisa, as opposed to two artists just simply or coincidentally making the same portrait. Same thing with plagiarism. We're assuming that two similar events have to be, let's say, two similar paragraphs that are word for word identical. They have to be due to common cause or plagiarism, because we're assuming that their origination probability has to have been, like, assuming it is super low. Sometimes you can have scenarios where it's actually not. Let's say you're writing some type of article and you're writing something by yourself. If it's only a sentence or two, it's conceivable, right? In the sense that the probability is not that low that some other author might have also written it a similar way, right? Even, let's say, in an identical way, right? That's how expressions work. But again, yeah, the point is that in all of these scenarios, similarity is coupled with low common probability to reach the conclusion of a common cause. So this slide just goes through the same thing, but just to break it down, what this is basically saying is that the product rule. The product rule states that for two independent events, for them both to happen, you multiply their probabilities, right? So if event X has probability P and Y has probability Q, then X and Y happening at the same time has a probability of P times Q, right? This is the product rule for independent events. Now, when apply this to life's origin, as well as any kind of feature of complex life, we see that if the chance of life, whether that be a single cell, a particular genome sequence, or even a whole human being, if the chance of that feature of life emerging on the planet is very low, in this case, I said 1 to a billion, right? Then two of those independent events, you would multiply 1 to a billion by 1 to a billion, and you would get 1 trillion times more improbable. With even smaller single probabilities, the combined chance becomes pretty much zero. The whole point here is that the more independent origins you require, the more astronomical the improbability kind of grows. That's why biologists historically felt more comfortable with ruling out multiple origins, right? The math makes multiple rare events pretty much impossible. And that's the point of all this. The whole point is that you're assuming low probabilities, low origination events. Again, I went through this before, but what if life wasn't that unlikely, right? So on that bead that we talked about, the string with the bead attached, if we move the bead all the way towards 1, then the origination probability is actually quite likely, almost a guarantee, right? This is one of the dilemmas that we actually see. What I mean by that is, if you, and we'll explore this in future topics as well, but if you go through the literature and look at abiogenesis research, we see that what scientists are trying to find is a way to increase the origination probability of life existing on Earth, right? Or whether that be the RNA world hypothesis or the extraterrestrial hypothesis, whatever it may be, right? Multiple researchers are researching the abiogenesis atmosphere. It's working under the guidance, the direction that they're trying to make origination probability more plausible. They're trying to increase it. Now, the consequence of that is that if life arises easily, then multiple origins also become plausible. But again, this undermines the whole logic behind one common ancestor, which is what modern evolutionary biologists are presupposing. So what this is going to show is that abiogenesis is actually quite counterproductive or contradictory to studies of evolutionary biology because of this particular issue, this tension, right? You have two specific scientific programs: the origin of life, which is trying to raise our probabilities of life, and also like phylogenetic inferences, which is trying to lower our probabilities, right? So again, this undermines the whole point of common ancestry, and these two goals logically conflict. It's a real confliction, right? Now, I have one more slide to cover here. We'll skip those slides, and so this slide, and I think I have one more. Okay, yeah. So now, all I want to say here is that scientists spoke of origin of life as a 1 in a million, or even worse chances than that, right? So the odds are clearly not in our favor. A second independent origin of life event would be almost absurd, right? I don't have the quote here, but I was going to show one of the quotes by a scientist, which confirms everything I just said, in the sense that it's so astronomically low origination probability for life to exist in the first place. But yeah, I don't have that quote anymore. But okay, just to reflect on everything, we can conclude this entire presentation by saying that in order to infer universal common descent, you need similarity. but you also need the assumption of having very low origination probability, right? So you can see that as a axiomatic, or rather an auxiliary hypothesis, right? It's coupled with universal common descent. To have Luca, it's necessary for life to be very improbable, right? And the moment that life becomes probable, then multiple origins also become plausible, right? That is the conclusion of the presentation.